Hello and welcome to Book 9 of St. Augustine's Confessions, which we'll call Death and Rebirth. Are you still reeling from Book 8 and that dramatic garden scene? In Book 9, we still have some drama to look at, but Book 9 is going to be the book that closes up the narrative events of Augustine's life. And then we move on to more abstract concepts like what is the meaning of time? Who is the Trinity? Things we could spend years on. But in Book 9, we're still in Augustine's life. And this is definitely a book about death and rebirth. And if you read it carefully, while there are literal deaths, like the passing of Monica, we are meant to look at death and rebirth through the lens of the baptismal font. So this is a book with the baptismal font at the center. And I think Augustine is really calling us to have, for lack of a better word, phrase, a sacramental heart. It forces me to ask, do I have a sacramental heart? Do you? If you know me, you probably know my family's from Italy. Years ago, when I went to my dad's town in Italy, I would stop and pay a visit to the baptismal font because as many issues as my family has, I like to look at that baptismal font and say a prayer of thanks because no matter what, I had the privilege of being baptized. What a gift. And so we think about baptism and we know when we bury someone at a Catholic Mass, the priest will always call to mind one's baptism. So that baptismal font, the coffin at the funeral mass, that's a line leading up to eternity. And Augustine is structuring this book in such a beautiful way for us to see that. In this book, Augustine decides to renounce his career. This is a big decision for him. You know, he's finally coming to terms with this reality that we all have to come to terms with, and that can be shocking, that his life is not going to be cruciform or like Christ's until he lets go of all of his disordered loves. You know, I can't help but think of the words of St. John of the Cross, who says, you know, it doesn't matter if you get rid of all your big disorders, there could be a tiny one like a thread that could still pull you down, you know. And that's what Augustine is dealing with here. He has to let go of his pursuits that even have a hint of vice in them, because as we all know, we're always doing things for God, but yet we're still serving ourselves. It's a very painful journey. So sometime probably around 386, Augustine resigns his post in Milano. And let's look at some of the words that he writes while this is happening. I think it's so beautiful. Augustine writes, "With the arrows of your charity you had pierced our hearts, and we bore your words within us like a sword, penetrating us to the core. The examples of your servants who you had changed from murky to luminous beings, from dead to living men, were crowding in upon our thoughts where they burned and consumed the heavy torpor that might have pulled us down again. So powerfully did they ignite us that every breath of opposition blew our flame into fiercer heat rather than extinguishing us." Augustine, true to his Roman identity, loves to use the words of fire. You know, he's the restless heart. Notice he's using the language of Cupid. He's using the language from Virgil's Aeneid, where Queen Dido has the arrow thrust into her heart with a disordered love for Aeneas. So Augustine is taking all those words about the arrow, the heart, the Cupid, love. He's taking all of it and he is transforming it into language for Christ. That's why Augustine is the intellectual foundation for the West, for Roman Catholics. He takes the language of the pagans and he makes them our own. And so he's saying, you know, me and my companions, we were on fire with worldly desires. Now we're on fire for Christ, and he's going to continue to tell us about their journey. And remember last book. I showed you that little chart where everyone's getting everyone excited about leaving the world and living as a monk. This is a book about getting excited to be baptized, okay? In the middle of all this, though, as you notice, his lungs bother him, his chest bothers him, and he has to take some time of rest. We also meet Verecundus. We met him earlier, but Augustine will comment how his marriage and his position in the world don't allow him to join his companions the way he would like in this full monastic way of life. However, Augustine will gather his friends at Verecundus's estate. And this is really important, this estate. This is about 20 or so miles northwest of Milano. And it is a famous place for Augustine. It is the village of Cassicium. And you've probably heard of the Cassicium dialogues. These are the first 4 works written by Augustine after his conversion to Christianity. They're done in form of dialogue because these people were living in a life of daily prayer, spiritual reflection, getting ready to be baptized. He will also then write about during this time is when he really falls in love with the Psalms. Augustine is a master of the Psalms. His mentor, Ambrose, wrote beautiful things about the Psalms, but it will be Augustine who is the master of how to read the Psalms. I would encourage you, you could just go online. You could go to New Advent, I believe. They have a section in the top right-hand corner on the Fathers. Not the best translations, but it's free. You could read all of Augustine's commentaries on the Psalms. Now, they are retranslated better, worth spending some money, but the way he writes his expositions on the Psalms are beautiful. And he writes about when the Psalms take over his life and what it does for him. During this time, he wants to help his friends, Augustine does. He wants for them to move out of vice into virtue. Also, we read about how he is tortured with a toothache. So it's interesting. He's got chest pains and he has a toothache. So I have a question for the reader. Is this merely medical recall, or is there a lesson for the reader? I think, knowing Augustine, there's got to be a lesson. And wouldn't we say when we have aches in our body, a lot of times the Lord is trying to get a message to us. So I think because Augustine knew so well the body and the soul are so closely joined, there is a lesson for him. He also shares with us, I think it's kind of funny, how he was given the book of Isaiah. And he just kind of says it casually that he sets it aside, just too much for him at that moment. So, hey, if you struggle with any books of the Bible, you should be excited that Augustine did also. Now, during this book, Verecundus, Nebridius, Adeodatus, and Monica, all of them, we hear reports about their baptism. We also hear reports about some of them dying. Now, it's not done chronologically, it's done thematically. And at the end of chapter 6, the last paragraph, we read these words. And so we were baptized. And all our dread about our earlier lives dropped away from us. But I want to say that again. And so we were baptized. To me, I feel like in the previous book when he said, and so I made my way to, remember he was working his way toward his friends who were going to change his life. The journey continues. It goes from that, then the journey's now to people being baptized. And that's the ultimate point of his book, is to show how we join the communion of the faithful, how we become sons and daughters of the Father in the church. And isn't it beautiful, because you and I, if we're baptized, we are joined to Augustine. He's our father in the faith, okay? We have that bond. And Augustine's a big one for showing while we all share the bond of the fall, we also share the bond of redemption, should we choose to do it. Augustine, Alypius, and Evodius are baptized, and they go on into new life. Then in chapter 7, there's this fascinating story, I love it, about Ambrose discovering the body of two saints. And there's a vision involved. These are the martyrs, Gervasius and Protasus, who were hidden. Bishop Ambrose, just to give you some background, he wanted to consecrate his cathedrals against the Arians. This was a big moment for the Arian heresy. He wanted to do it in a special way, and he wanted to have the remains of Milan's patron saints. These were the patron saints, who went to their deaths, by the way, under the Emperor Marcus Aurelius, probably around 170 or 180. Through some sort of vision, in the year 386, Ambrose was led to dig under the church of St. Felix and St. Nabor and found the martyrs' skeletons, their heads duly severed. June 19 is the actual feast day where we celebrate when Ambrose had those relics moved, okay? And the church loves to do this. If you look at one saint, you're going to look at another and another and another. And where did you dig? I'm living in New Mexico, so I can't help but think of the Santuario of Chimayo, where we know that someone had a vision of where our Lord wanted a cross to be and dug, and we have special dirt. We called Chimayo the Lords of America. It's a very special place, but very much in line with this Catholic tradition, going back to our early roots. And so this is a big deal for St. Ambrose, who was not shy about fighting against Arianism. And then as we continue into chapter 8, we have the story of Monica. First, we hear about Evodius, who we learn, Augustine says he was from our hometown. He was, like Augustine, born in Africa. He also embarked on an imperial career, but he had come to Christianity much earlier. He and Augustine seem here to have met up sometime after Milan, but before Augustine's return to Africa. So scholars put it around somewhere about 387 in Rome. And he plays a big part of his life. Evodius will eventually become the bishop of Utalis, a tiny town outside of Carthage, while he and Augustine stayed in seemingly good touch most of their adult life. So he's very important also. We also get in here, Augustine likes to give us layers. We hear the story about how Monica, how she became a saint, and how she wasn't always a saint, and how she enjoyed her wine too much while she was cooking. It's such a great story. And it's a great story because who got her to change? Not someone who loved her, a servant who was mean to her. A lot of times the people who hate us the most, who are the most hateful, the Lord will use them to bring about a great good. It's amazing. And I like what Augustine says when he ends chapter 8. He says, through one unwholesome soul, you brought wholeness to another. Isn't that beautiful how the Lord wastes nothing? So that no one who takes note of this episode may ascribe it to his own power if another person who, in his opinion, stands in need of correction is put right by some word of his. Really, for Augustine, everyone needs conversion. And the Lord uses everyone when a person truly wants to follow God. And it's beautiful. And so this is how Monica is able to temper her own behavior. Now, I did want to bring up, I think that the language about Monica and her life, it can be disturbing language. What am I talking about? Well, Augustine talks about how great Monica dealt with a difficult husband, okay? So what is a difficult husband? What are the levels? There's different levels of a difficult husband. And what is Augustine approving of and disapproving of? I think it's good to take this paragraph apart, because I have met a lot of people who turn away from Augustine because of this. So I think it's good to give Augustine his fair trial, let's say. Augustine is praising Monica for knowing how to handle a difficult husband. He goes on to talk about other women who maybe did not fare so well. He says that, other wives had violent husbands they had to put up with. He talks about a rumor of Patricius striking his wife, etc., etc., and how Monica persevered. Well, is Augustine counseling women to remain in abusive relationships? I don't think so. But I do see how people could perhaps come to that conclusion. I think the language is disturbing, maybe could use a little more nuance, but I would argue that Augustine is not explicitly supporting domestic abuse. However, looking at a lot of scholars, perhaps he does support certain patterns of thought in the ancient world that show they were still in need of purification. And this is, I think, a beautiful topic that we have as Catholics. I think one of the most exciting things about being Catholic is our intellectual tradition, which is why we have this podcast, is so very nuanced. And in our age of quick sound bites, TikTok, nobody actually wants to pick up a book and read. It's exciting to know we have a rich intellectual history. What do I mean by that? I mean that we have doctrine, but we do have what's called the development of doctrine. In the church, our teachings do not change, but some of them can develop. So, for example, we know certain things are never going to change. For example, the canon is closed for Scripture. The canon is closed. If we suddenly found a book in the Dead Sea, we're not going to add it to our canon. We also know that the priesthood is reserved to men alone. We have all the criteria for a doctrine that won't change. But there has been development of doctrine in other areas. And when we look at the complementary between men and women, that's one exciting area. So when we look at Augustine and his words, I bring to you this author and this book. This is a small book. It's part of a trilogy by Sister Prudence Allen, an amazing book, taking all the great thinkers before the church up until the present day. And she talks about how did pagans and then church thinkers look at women? What is a woman? And if you read her, she'll argue for Augustine and Aquinas believed that women did have equal dignity, but in order to get to the fuller understanding that, say, someone like St. Pope John Paul II had, that's a true development of doctrine. And we can see that going back to like 1970 with Pope Paul VI, where he did name a female doctor of the church. So that is clearly development of doctrine. If you're interested in this topic, the master is Cardinal Newman, who wrote about the development of doctrine. I'll just give you a few keys in case you're interested. In order for a doctrine to organically develop, he says, it should have anticipation of its future. It should have conservative action in its past, with the original idea not being corrupted or destroyed. He also, I love this term, he says there should be chronic vigor of a true development. So he says, what's a development and what's a corrupting idea? We could go back again, like I said, to women priests. That would never be an authentic development because we have never had women priests. We don't have an intellectual tradition or a historical tradition, and anything leading to that would be a destruction of the original idea of the priesthood in and of itself. So he has a beautiful way of talking about perversions and decays. But when we look at the development of doctrine, according to Sister Prudence Allen in this book, she says when we enter the flowering of the Carmelite Age in the 20th century, we have, quote, chronic vigor, of the integral complementarity of woman and man. And that's a phrase that takes a whole book to explain. But what she's saying is it's a beautiful vision of the fullness of man, the fullness of woman, philosophically able to work together and to be together. And she actually uses John of the Cross and Teresa of Avila as kind of a starting point in the 16th century. She moves all the way up to the 20th century for this full communion of persons that she's looking at. But she does, in her previous book, go all the way back to Augustine. That's why I'm taking the time to tell you. We could go from Augustine in the 4th century to Aquinas in the Middle Ages, to John Paul II in the 20th century, and we could see the development of doctrine about what a woman is. And that would help us perhaps purify our language just a little bit. This little paragraph here about Augustine discussing men striking their wives. Maybe he, if he lived in the 20th century, he'd have a little more nuanced view of that. Nevertheless, in spite of that, one could argue that Augustine's treatment of his mother, Monica, is so magnificent and so full of acclaim that some people have said the Confessions is a book about Monica and not Augustine. Now you might say, oh, well, that's just because, a Monica is a mother and Augustine values motherhood. Again, going back to Sister Prudence Allen and the theology of the body, all men are called to fatherhood. All women are called to motherhood, which reaches its full expression spiritually. Begins biologically for many, but ends spiritually for all. And that's the culminating point, to be a spiritual father or mother, like John Paul II or like Mother Teresa. Or Augustine was a biological father and a spiritual father. But anyway, as we know, biological parents are called to spiritual parenthood. So forgive me, that wasn't a tangent. It was just a way for me to reframe some of the discussion that goes on about Augustine and the early church fathers, because we need the church fathers and we need to be able to put them in dialogue, I think, with some of our modern thinkers. Now back to Monica. There's such an amazing passage here where he has a moment with Monica. What did you think about his moment with her at Ostia? It's a vision, really. It's a vision where they're no longer just in Ostia. Well, scholars have a lot to say about this. Some might consider it a moment of ecstasy in the Confessions, a rare moment of vision shared by two creatures together. Because, if you read it carefully, Augustine and Monica simultaneously are lifted out of their bodies and out of the created order into some sort of direct union with God. Well, what do we do with this? What do we say about this? I feel like we have to stop the podcast for a moment. This is a lot. This is rare. So I don't know if I want to say too much about it. Thank goodness. I do always turn to Dr. Kreft. I think he puts a good... I wouldn't call it a spin. I think he gives some good remarks about Ostia. And I like it because he calls this section Mysticism with Monica. It almost sounds like a podcast. He says, whether this was an authentic mystical experience or not depends upon how we define the term. The fact that it followed a clear cosmological map, the fact that it was intellectual should not disqualify it. But if it was a mystical experience, it was unusual in three ways. First, it was in words, in speech, at least until it reached its end. Most mystics emphasize the radical inadequacy of all human language to describe it. But words are more powerful sacred agents for Augustine than they are for most of us in the modern age. The second feature is even more unique. The experience is not solitary but shared. Now, Dr. Kraft says the third feature is unparalleled in human history. Probably because of my background in history, whenever I hear something's unparalleled in history, I want to get the trumpets out and pay attention. He says what's unparalleled is the other person was the mystic's mother. Let's think about that. Now, a few days after this happened, we know, to everyone's surprise, except for Monica and God, Dr. Kraft says, she died. So Augustine has hindsight, but he confesses his lack of foresight. This is one of the powers of memory, which, this is getting us ready for Book 10, the masterpiece on what is memory. And Augustine's putting it right here in the trenches like, oh my, I'm dealing with death, with this mystical experience. How does memory work? A lot to think about here. Also, I think if you look at the vision carefully, it's like a ladder, which is very important in all of classical literature. If you study Plato, if you study Euclid, if you study Boethius, it's always a ladder of ascent. And Augustine is definitely following that tradition, even though he didn't know Greek, but he's following that tradition. Dr. Kraft says, the good and beautiful voices of created things, which are rungs of this cosmic ladder, each utter their own proper sound as we climb them, and after they sing to us. Voices must grow silent as we move above them. So, we've talked before for Augustine, there's words, there's speech, and then there's silence, which is its own teacher. Monica's death and Augustine's reaction to it is the last important event in the narrative of the Confessions. It's the beginning of Augustine's life, but it's the end of Monica's. And this is something you and I can relate to because we all have parents, and this is something for us to think about. But in that sense, the book is a story more of Monica's life than of Augustine's, perhaps. I did want to address Augustine's reaction. I don't think he reacts really in 100% healthy way. He doesn't seem to be 100% fully integrated. Why? Well, he was deeply influenced by pagan, Stoic philosophy. And I think in our time, I think as Catholics who try to be orthodox, there's a tradition in our church of being overly maybe influenced by Jansenism or rigorism. And we don't I think we just don't know how to deal with our emotions. So we're not that different from Augustine. I think we either overuse our emotions or stuff them. It's very hard to integrate them properly. And, as I was reading this, I was thinking about, well, what is the best way to integrate them properly? And I like what Dr. Kraft says so much. I actually found it really healing for myself. He said, the integration of reason and the passions is one that Augustine never quite resolved. But some say we just aren't meant to in this life. And the tension that Augustine is really bringing to the forefront here between the reason, passion, grief, and for this earth, but living for the next world. That tension is not resolved, and that is the restless heart, isn't it? I feel like for everything we've gone through with Augustine, here is where the restless heart, you can just feel it beating, and you can feel the tension. You can examine it in your own life and say, we can't resolve this tension. Only divine mercy can, and God will do it differently for each family. But what a blessing to see how it was done for Augustine, because later in his life, I think he'll come to terms with that. But it's a beautiful model for us to think about Augustine, Monica, death, and rebirth. And I hope and pray this book will heal all of us going through the death of our own loved ones, and helping new ones to enter the baptismal font. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time for Book 10.